Thank you very, very much for making the time to come this evening. It's actually a real joy to introduce Dr. Garwood Anderson, Dean of Nashotah House, because of lots of reasons. One is that Nashotah House has been a very, very faithful partner in the Diocese of Central Florida for decades, actually. And there are plenty of Nashotah alums here in the Diocese of Central Florida. I will also say that I go up there probably on the average of once a year, and I preach and I meet individually with students and faculty for pastoral care, and it is a refreshing place to be. It's genuinely a joy to be a part of that. But also, I love what God has put together, because as many of you know, Nashotah House is historically an Anglo-Catholic seminary, but yet their head, their dean, was originally out of Asbury, Central Florida InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and a layman, not a priest. That's, for me, actually a pretty great combination. And I bet it does, but that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So a little bit about him. I would be remiss if I did not read a little out of his CV. He has been a member of the Nashotah House Seminary faculty since 2007, has served as dean since 2017. He does have roots here in Central Florida. He was on the faculty of Asbury Seminary. He's also taught as a visiting professor at Bethel Theological Seminary, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, Reformed Theological Seminary, and the West African Theological Seminary in Lagos, Nigeria. Prior to his academic career, Dr. Anderson served for 17 years on campus staff of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, where he ministered on numerous college campuses, including the divisional director for Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for 11 years. He's received numerous awards. He is a jazz fan. I didn't know about that. You and I can talk about that. Been married to his wife, Dawn, since 1983, 3 adult children, 2 sons-in-law, and a grandson. He and his family are active members at Zion Episcopal Church in Oconomowoc. The last thing I want to say about Gar Anderson, as he is known, is that he really is a colleague, someone I consider a colleague, particularly in trying to offer a witness into the wider Episcopal Church and the global communion. He and I talk about that on a relatively regular basis. And out of that, and all sorts of other things, he's become a friend, for which I am personally very, very grateful. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Garwood Anderson.
Thank you all. What a delight and a privilege to be among you. I'm going to begin with a brief personal word, a short commercial, 3 minutes long, and then we'll get into the lecture, the paper for the evening. Well, the brief personal word is this. You may or may not know it, but I found my home in the Episcopal Church right here in this diocese. Ernie knows that, Bishop Brewer. I met a young woman at Asbury Theological Seminary who came to our seminary, Sarah Bronos. For sure you were younger then, anyway. And she was one of my students. And along the way, she invited me a number of times to teach adult education at All Saints in Winter Park. And I had become a sort of convictional Anglican about a decade earlier, but without a worshiping home. And all I can remember from All Saints were 2 things. One was I couldn't believe how much these people wanted to learn about the Bible, which was a delight to me. And then the second thing that I got there was I got to stay for worship. And in the process of staying for worship, I had found my ecclesial home, having been sort of pan-everything. And finally I knew, in fact, I was an Episcopalian, and I had found a home. So I was confirmed here in this diocese by Bishop Powell in 2006, Sarah being one of my sponsors. Then she went off to a weird seminary up north in Wisconsin, against her will for 1 year, and she went up there and got me a job. said to the dean he ought to hire this person. He wasn't quick to the draw, but he was compliant. Most people comply with what Sarah tells them to do. I have. And I was up there in 2007, and I've been there since. I'd never expected, especially as a layperson, especially lacking certain Anglo-Catholic credentials, to be the dean of that seminary. But it's been a joy to have that role of leadership there. We are thrilled with the Diocese of Central Florida, the students that you have sent to us, the ones we send them back, usually not prematurely. We send them back to you. We're delighted by the ministry that they have. You have some wonderful people with us right now. We'll take all that you want to send, because Central Florida folk make our seminary a better place. So thank you for all that you've done for us. I'm going to give you just the shortest 3-minute video here. It's a bit of a commercial about our seminary. You'll see 3 current students speaking. Ignacio Gama, originally of Mexico City, more recently of Massachusetts. He's a lawyer by training and professionally, and a trained opera singer from New England Conservatory. Jamal Scarlett is from Missouri, and a priest in an advanced degree program at Nashotah House. And then you'll meet Kristen Gunn. I think they tell the Nashotah ethos really well. It only lasts 3 minutes, and hopefully it'll be a joy for you to watch. You'll see that people wear masks in this video because that's when we filmed it. So here you go.
What's truly different about Nashotah is that it's so much more than a school. It's just not an institution that you just go to in the morning and have your classes. It's really a culture in which you are immersed, and you have the opportunity to make lasting friendships. And I think that's something that I've found here. There are, of course, challenges in the everyday life and in our academic work and our school work. And you always feel that somebody's looking after you in a way, and you have the opportunity to be an encouragement for others as well.
The reason why I think you should choose Nashotah is because it is a place where you are able to be restored in the waters of the tradition, a place where you're able to be theologically grounded and spiritually formed in a way that helps you to lead the church into the world.
The ways in which we learn here go really beyond the doors of the classroom. We begin our day with prayer and end it with prayer. And I think that's particularly important because, as most of the things we do here, they're habit forming. And especially those of us that are hoping to be in ordained ministry, we need to think about these things. How do we begin our day? How do we end our day? Who are we doing it for? And it's a way of learning, a way to teach ourselves. The relationship with God that we foster here, and relationships with one another are crucial in what we do.
Hopefully there's nothing that exists here that only exists here because it's so good. One would hope that what exists here is what has existed in the church for centuries. And we're finding a possible version of that here. And I think a very pure-hearted and beautiful version of that here. Maybe it's what's not here, Maybe it's, I think there's a much lower degree and tolerance for fakeness here. To have that kind of community in the modern world, in the 21st century, and in the country that we live in, is where else do you find that?
If you're looking for a place that you're willing to wrestle with faith in a meaningful, honest way, if you're looking for a seminary to be a place where you're also looking to be formed, I mean, you genuinely want to be formed for the church for the sake of the world. This is it.
Nashotah House has doubled its enrollment since the fall of 2017 in the last 4.5 years. So we were among the smallest seminaries in the Episcopal Church just in 2017, and we're, with another seminary, the second largest seminary in the Episcopal Church today, and growing. So God has been good to us. There's been an enormous number of, tremendous additions to our faculty, and we're just thrilled with what God is doing there. We're delighted that you're partners with us in all of that. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to answer questions about any of that when we have our reception a little later, but thank you, Bishop, especially for indulging that little commercial. I appreciate it. Well, it's great to be with you tonight. The lecture tonight is called Strangers, Aliens, and Citizens, First Century Wisdom for a 21st Century Church. And I'll tell you how this came about. This was a paper originally given at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary for a conference there. Somehow I ended up talking to Bishop Brewer, and he said, well, could I have a copy? And of course, you want somebody to read your papers. Allegedly, he did. Okay. And he said, I'd love to have you give this in our diocese. So understand this is somewhat of an academic paper. Those require a little bit of extra work. I may break into it with a little spontaneity here or there, but largely this is a lecture. And I am drawn to 1 Peter because the ecclesial vision there is one that we need to hear in our day in the midst of a lot of ecclesial Christian confusion in our culture. I think it speaks today in a very powerful way. Well, here we go. 1 Peter shares conceptual features across the various corpora of the New Testament. But nevertheless, 1 Peter is an echo of none of those. One 19th century New Testament scholar, H.J. Holtzman, comments wryly that based on the traditions that one finds in 1 Peter, the author must have known the whole New Testament. That was a joke when Holtzman said it. Maybe not today. That's a tongue-in-cheek comment. But the point is, there's something about this letter that I suppose accidentally makes it synthetic. Yes, it has a time and a place. It has particular social motivations, but there's something synthetic about this letter that brings New Testament themes together into one place. Not too long ago, New Testament scholars used to refer to it as the exegetical stepchild of the New Testament, a text that didn't get enough attention. That's largely changed. That said, it is arguably a curious exercise to explore the ecclesiology of a letter that never names its audience as an ecclesia, the Greek word for church. Why a discourse this conditioned by tradition never uses that term can be a question that only occasions speculation, but one thinks of at least three possible and not mutually exclusive reasons. The first is this: the author's most important ecclesial claim is not that the recipients are ecclesia, but that they are Israel, somehow newly reconfigured. Second, the author's chief rhetorical burden is to steer these communities into a manner of life, an anastrophe, a conversation, a way of living, of recognizable holiness against overwhelming pressures to capitulate or, alternatively, to isolate. And three, in that vein, as John Eliot has argued indefatigably, the community addressed is a household rather than an ecclesia comprising households. Thus, the fundamental image of the church in 1 Peter is Israel and household. Now, whether any of that explains the absence of ecclesia in the letter's discourse is more than anyone could say. I offer these not so much as an argument from silence, but to suggest that silence with the word ecclesia is a phenomenon that invites reflection. Yet, as an ecclesial reflection, this letter holds its own with any document in the New Testament. Indeed, this encyclical, written to a group of churches, not just one, this encyclical seemingly touches on every conceivable dimension of what we like to call ecclesiology, lacking only the word for church. It offers a rich and varied metaphorical depiction of the people of God. It offers a similar and paradoxical account of the relation of the Christian community to the world. It has a saturation of probable baptismal language. It offers a tidy and brief, instructive account of spiritual gifts, and even a hint, though not a lot more, of church order. It's all there. In salvation historical or eschatological concord with the broad strokes of the New Testament, 1 Peter offers less of a corrective or a recipe for ecclesial renewal than it sees the church, again never so named, as renewal itself, as a new covenant fulfillment of Israel's promise, and bearing and imparting from itself eschatological life to its members and to the world. 1 Peter understands that this renewed state of affairs births a people animated by eschatological life. We have been born anew to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are, again, born anew, not of perishable seed, but imperishable, through the living and abiding Word of God. We have entered into already an inheritance, imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for us. Thus, here as elsewhere, the pattern of new covenant promise fulfilled and new creation life anticipated marks the identity of the people of God. Point number 1, constructing Christian identity. This evening I will focus primarily on 1 Peter's contribution to our understanding of Christian identity. I choose this as our point of departure simply because I believe it is the author's point of departure. If we were to ask, what is the identity of the church? From the vantage point of 1 Peter, the starting point would have to be the same as the author's in the very first verse of the letter, where he addresses his readers as the elect sojourners of a diaspora. Elect sojourners of a diaspora. Now, while the force of each of these terms is subject to some dispute, it is evident upon any reading that the identity of the readers is couched in this paradox. Indeed, as I will argue, constructed to be a paradox. In the very juxtaposition of elect and sojourners, eklektois peripedemois, is found the letter's theme, an identity construction that indelibly frames the world of the letter's readers. Now, I say identity construction here not just because it's in vogue to say those kinds of things, but because the evidence suggests that constructing an identity is precisely and intentionally what our author is doing. Now, that claim hinges on 2 judgments. One, that despite the proliferation of descriptive biblical and Jewish metaphor, the recipients of this letter are not ethnically Jewish, or at least not predominantly so. I'm proposing that this is a predominantly Gentile audience described in Jewish biblical terms. 2, that the reference to their resident alien status under various names is likewise a metaphor rather than a literal description of a socio-political plight. right? So they actually are not resident aliens in the real world, but are described as such by the letter's author. Now, both of those judgments have been gone hither and yon, to and fro, but ultimately, the claim that these are literal refugees or a Jewish audience failed to convince me. I have about 4 pages of small print that I'm not going to read to you to try to convince you. If you have a question, we could talk about that later. So, now, what that means then is that a theological reading of 1 Peter as a letter is enriched if we understand that this is a predominantly Gentile audience, here depicted as Israel on the one hand, who are not literal refugees or resident aliens, but are described as so on the other. That makes all the difference. If the dense Jewish covenantal description of the recipients merely speaks of them as they are ethnically, then the author simply tells them what they already knew of themselves. And we might ask, well, to what effect? Why? Well, if they already know that's who they are, why do they need to be told? And if, however, the readers are, as most interpreters understand, ethnically Gentile, or predominantly so, this unrelenting description of the recipients as though now covenantally Israel carries tremendous import. Likewise, if the author merely acknowledges the reader's social circumstances as though facts on the ground, that they're refugees, we might give the author some credit for his pastoral sensitivity, rather more than his theological insight. As it is, on the supposition that these readers are neither Jews nor literal exiles, we cannot conclude otherwise than that our author is engaged in a most willful act of identity construction. I would say a mythos in service of an ontos, right? A myth, a story in the service of an identity. If these judgments are correct, then these Gentiles, or this ethnically mixed readership, described as elect sojourners of a diaspora, are being provocatively cast in a very specific way. And it is not an overstatement, therefore, to consider 1 Peter as the New Testament ecclesiology par excellence. Moreover, not merely the themes of the letter, but the paradox of Christian identity is found in the very juxtaposition of these 2 words, elect, strangers. It is unfortunate in this regard, and I try not to I try not to criticize Bible translations, but here we go. It is unfortunate in this regard that the 3 English translations of the Bible that our tradition is most familiar with, the King James, the Revised Standard, and I think most disappointingly in this case, the New Revised Standard, all manage to obscure the author's paradox by transposing the word for elect from verse 1 to verse 2. Now, I know your Greek's good, so you're not going to just follow the English if you prefer, but this is what I want you to see. So, Petros Apostolos Iesu Christo eklektois perpedemois diasporas, chosen, elect, strangers, sojourners. There it is, chosen, elect, strangers. What does the KJV, RSV, New Revised Standard say? Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion. There's a word missing. It'll come, but it's going to take a while. In Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, chosen. Do you see what happened there? Eklektois became chosen in the next verse, chosen and destined. Prognosine, foreknown. Now, can you see how dramatically different that is? If you can, I'll explain it. The word eklektois, elect, is a technical term in the Bible for the collective people of God. But here it's rendered as though a passive participle, chosen. The effect, thus, is to turn an identity construction, an ecclesiology, into something like a soteriological claim, right? How did they become exiles? Well, they were chosen and destined for it. But that is not what 1 Peter is saying. And thus, the evocative paradox of the original juxtaposition is obscured. Indeed, it is literally lost in translation. Thus, the right and left lenses, elect, stranger, through which the entire letter is meant to be read, are turned into kind of a monergistic monocle, which is not Peter's point. I know some of you went to RTS. I hope I'm okay so far. All of that might be true, but it ain't what it says, okay? If, however, we agree that this is indeed the author's proposal, two observations follow. The first is that these grammatically connected terms, elect, stranger, although they stand in the sharpest conceptual contrast, elect and strangers are related to one another as cause and effect. In other words, the privilege, the belonging, the security of election, of being God's own possession, the glory of which this author finds inexpressible, is actually the cause of the exilic experience, with all its pains and threats and marginality in the world. These are not simply offset by some future glory, but they are the present consequence of the very privileged status, the bifocal existence of Christians in the world. This is because, as one New Testament writer would put it, it is true on the one hand that friendship with the world is enmity with God, but the converse is also true. Exclusive loyalty to God may well incur the contempt of the world. In any case, 1 Peter tells his readers that they should not be caught off guard if it is the case. Quoting later, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you, as though something strange were happening to you. For heaven's sakes," he says, "you're God's chosen people. What else would you expect?" But only a paradox can think that way. Now, reading 1 Peter canonically, it is natural to infer that the basis for the exile or alien metaphors is that there is a truer citizenship in a heavenly kingdom, which indeed the Bible says in a number of places. But this otherwise reasonable inference, casually and innocently assumed by many 1 Peter commentators, is not actually a feature of 1 Peter's metaphorical furniture. You follow? What I'm saying is the fact that they are aliens and strangers is not because 1 Peter is invoking a citizenship in heaven. He could have, but he's not. If we were to ask the author why or how it is that those bearing the name of Christian are aliens and strangers, the answer seems rather that this is the alienating consequence of an enacted holiness. It is a here and now consequence of an enacted holiness. But just as he who called you is holy, be holy in all your conduct, for it is written, "You shall be holy, for I am holy," citing Leviticus 19:2. You see, their recently adopted abstentions, change of life, are found strange by their social peers. And when they do not join in as they had, they are vilified for it. They are made socially to be aliens and strangers. Indeed, these ethnic Gentiles now bear the designation of Israel so without qualification and bear a Christian manner of life so distinctive that by Gentiles now, the author refers to the pervasive socio-religious juggernaut from which his readers have been delivered and from whom they now suffer scorn. In other words, to put it simply, he ain't calling these Gentiles Gentiles anymore. That's how Israel they are. Gentiles are something else, but they're Gentiles. You see the point? Instead, the language of alien... I jumped ahead. The source of this ostracism from their contemporaries is the result of that enacted social ethos of differentiation that we call by the name holy. So we could speak, if we wish, of some otherworldly citizenship, but the author of 1 Peter does not. Other authors do. Instead, the language of alien and exile is figurative language accounting for a literal experience of alienation now in the world. Indeed, the whole of 1 Peter is shot through with this paradoxical identity. It would be fair to say that election marks out the first movement of the letter, and sojourner marks out the second. The first movement being 1:3 to 2:10, the privilege of the elect. The second movement of the letter, the vocation of the sojourners, 2:11 through 4:11. And we find the turning point, the particular concentration of these images in chapter 2, verses 9 through 12, just as we might expect it at the hinge of the letter. Chapter 2, 9, and 10 expands on election with a collection of biblical figures, a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people peculiarly belonging to God. And then 11 and 12 follow without transition to expand on that alien and stranger theme, introducing what will follow an irregular kind of household code, telling them how to live in the world. So, together, chapter 2, verses 9 through 12 is the bold, scripture-saturated conclusion to the pivotal account of election in 1:3 to 2:10 in the immediately preceding verses. As you come to him, he says in 2:4, a living stone rejected by men, yet to God elect and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house. Thus, it is understood that the election of Christians is derivative from and concomitant to God's election of Jesus Christ. Or to put it differently, participation in the election of Jesus Christ by God is the consequence of sharing in God's own election of his Son. We become God's elect for esteeming God's elect one. Thus, we become living stones joined to the living stone and made into a spiritual house and a holy priesthood. Now, the grammar of this somewhat complex two-verse sentence should not be passed by without remark or a slide. There is some question what is intended here, because for those of you who remember any Greek, the grammatical form of the main verb, oikodomeste, may be parsed either as an imperative, that would be something like a command, or an indicative. This is always the case in the second person plural. An indicative, as the RSV and New Revised Standard render it, the force might be an exhortation to let oneself be built into a spiritual house, which will probably then carry with it the implied mood of the introductory phrase of the preceding verse, yielding something like this: come to him and let yourselves be built. A kind of invitation. Well, I have no problem with that invitation, but I think it's highly unlikely that it's the meaning of the text. The alternative is that the text can be read not as an exhortation, but as an assertion of what is, or we would call it the indicative mood. Oikodomeste in the indicative is speaking not to what we must do, but declaring what in fact is wrought by God in our coming to Christ, the living stone. Put simply, as you come to him, ... you are being built into a holy priesthood, into a royal temple. So, understood this way, we detect the faint outlines of something along the lines of a Catholic, which is to say, Anglican ecclesiology. In other words, there is no coming to the person of Christ that is not also at the same time an incorporation into the spiritual house being built by God. There are no individual Christians. Even if we come to Christ individually, we are being incorporated into a corporate entity, the house of God. The election of Jesus Christ, thus, is concomitant with the election of a people bearing his name and thus grafted into his vocation. Incorporation into Christ is a gift and not an accomplishment. Likewise, the church is not a voluntary, elective epiphenomenon, but it is constitutive of Christian identity. Let me put this in simpler terms. Joining the church is not like joining a golf club. I'm not talking about social status now. What I mean is you can be a golfer and not belong to a golf club. Or you can at least play golf and not belong to a golf club. I'm evidence of this. I can't afford it. But you might say to yourself, well, I do like golf, and belonging to a golf club could maybe help me be a better golfer. And you know, they have pros there, and they can help you with your game. And I'll be among a community of people who also like to golf. And you can belong to a golf club for a while, and if the pros at that club aren't really helping your game, maybe you'd want to go to another golf club where the pros are better. You see what I'm saying? If you don't like the community of golfers you're with, maybe you join a different golf club. But the point is, you don't have to be in a golf club to be a golfer. This is not Christian ecclesiology. There is no coming to Christ whereby we are not also incorporated into the body of Christ. Period. Full stop. Whether we like the golf pros or not. Right? Okay. So following immediately, and I'll do this quickly, in verses 6 through 8, the author appeals in rapid succession to three sort of different Old Testament stone texts. In turn, Isaiah 28:16, Psalm 118:22, Isaiah 8:14. You don't have to remember that. You may note that Isaiah 28:16 and Isaiah 8:14 are featured by Paul also in Romans chapter 9 in close collocation. And Psalm 118:22, you might remember, is found in the parable of the wicked tenants, right? The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, is the conclusion to that parable. Now, the point of these three stone testimonies is that they are drawn together around a word, stone, that has three different references in the original Old Testament. So, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. 1 Peter 2:6 from Isaiah 28:16. And here it seems fairly clear that the stone is a remnant of Israel. And then secondly, to you then who believe, he is precious, but for those who do not believe, quote, the stone that the builders has rejected has become the very head of the corner. And here, likely, although somewhat disputed, is perhaps a messianic reference. So a remnant of Israel, a messianic reference, and then the third, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, seems indubitably to be a reference to the Lord Jehovah, the God of Israel. Now, that is either confused or brilliant. So which of those three stones is Jesus? Does anyone know the right answer? The answer is yes. Yes, the remnant of Israel, the righteous, holy remnant of Israel, the Messiah, none other than God himself. And he determines a people that belong to him. Coming to that stone, built into that living stone, we become living stones, becoming a temple unto God. All of this comes to a profound conclusion in verses 9 and 10, when we find out that living and united to the living stone, we are named by a proliferation of Old Testament covenantal descriptors. An elect race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people possessed by God. Now, there are a number of places where those come from, but chiefly they come from Exodus 19, the middle two terms, and Isaiah chapter 43, the outside two terms. It is as if the author has drawn from the Declaration of Independence, Exodus, and then from the Gettysburg Address in the reconstitution of the nation. And he is saying, you are that people. Now, mind you, if these are Gentiles, and we think they are, what a remarkable thing that he has said there. Now, a lot could be said about each of those descriptions, but together, they pull together from the Exodus Sinai Constitution and the exilic reconstitution of Israel, showing once again the sheer willfulness of the predication of this identity on Gentiles in northern Asia Minor. Lord, Lord, Lord. These who were, until very recently, aliens and strangers to the commonwealth of Israel, to quote Paul, are now aliens and strangers in the world and the people of God unto God. Okay, finally, election and vocation. Equally significant for our ecclesial reflection is the following ascription of purpose that we see immediately. You are this, he says, once you had not received mercy, now you have received mercy, in order that you might proclaim, and the word here is variously translated, praises. I think the right translation is virtues. Might proclaim the virtues of the one who called you out of darkness into his light. So the whole point, thus, of being this reconstituted people of God is that is not an end in itself. Election is always unto vocation, more than unto vocation, but not less. And the vocation here is that in order that you might proclaim the virtues, the goodnesses, the excellencies of the one, namely God, who called you out of darkness into his light. Now, our standard translations take this all-important clause in a variety of exegetically defensible ways with shades of difference. Some say praises, some say mighty deeds. Those minor variations aside, it seems that the primary sense of the clause is that election breeds a vocational end for the people of God that is irreducibly evangelical. The purpose of this extraordinary election of Gentiles, this unforeseen renewal of the people of God, is that they might testify ex angelo to the enacted virtues and mercy of a redeeming God. That's why we have been called. Not just to belong, but to proclaim, in word and deed. This evangelistic vocation is borne out in what follows immediately. The text turns in verses 11 and 12 as if on a hinge from the election wrought in Christ to the consequent vocation of that same people in the world. Thus again, verses 9 and 10, the claim of election, like verse 1, is juxtaposed to verses 11 and 12 as election is to strangers, in an expansive reprise of the first verse of the letter. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers. Right? Notice then that the exalted and exclusive relationship to God described in verses 9 and 10 is implicitly productive of a marginalized and alienated existence of the same to the world. The beloved of God are now the offscourings of the world. not by accident, but by design. Yet as such, precisely as such, the marginalized and the maligned are dignified with an evangelical charter to the world. Well, there is no hint of grandiosity, no triumphalistic plan here to reach the world for Jesus Christ in our generation, or some kind of sloganeering. The author is hardly content to counsel mere survival, which would have been perhaps our impulse. It is assumed rather that the holy, elect people of God, aliens and strangers though they are nonetheless as depicted on mission, albeit a mission largely portrayed in terms of quiet and resilient holiness. On the one hand, they are to resist the fleshly lust that war against the soul. On the other, they are to resolve to lead a recognizably virtuous public life. And thus the author posits two outcomes. This tactic, if you will, to lead such good lives among the Gentiles. Remember, they're Gentiles, but they're not Gentiles. To lead such good lives among the Gentiles that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, they may see your good behavior and glorify God on the day of his visitation. This tactic, thus, will silence the slander of contemptuous onlookers, a contempt that the author regards as inevitable but not insurmountable, so that when they malign you as evildoers, they may instead behold your good works. Again, a few verses later, he says, it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. 2, he holds the more ambitious hope that the manner of life of these Gentiles among Gentiles will be such that observing their honorable deeds, these who once scoffed will instead glorify God on the day of his visitation. Now, although there might be some variety of ways that these spectators could glorify God on the day of his visitation, the most contextually compelling is that having observed and been silenced by the good deeds, they are converted by means of the same, such that the great and terrible day of the Lord is transformed into a day of rejoicing. Thanks be to God. Some ecclesial implications. As depicted by 1 Peter, the missional life of aliens and strangers bears 3 marks. 1, it is incarnate and non-isolationist. He commends a brave life conducted among the Gentiles, not isolated from them. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any real problem. An incarnate and non-isolationist, brave life conducted among the Gentiles. 2, it is a socially apologetic life. It extinguishes the slander of hostile bystanders who have nothing evil they can say against you. 3, it is subversively evangelistic, whereby God is glorified by his erstwhile enemies. Those otherwise holding on for dear life are counseled rather to hold out a precious life for the sake of their overlords, for their abusers, for their persecutors. This is the clear pattern of the ensuing and thematically illustrative illustrations, in turn to citizens, 2:13-17, to slaves, 2:18-25, and to predominantly wives, 3:1-6. Concluding with the exhortation to the whole community to live with a holy resolve peaceably among hostile forces under the watchful eye of a requiting Lord, 3:8-14. Rightly understood, these exhortations to aliens and strangers are not a passive acquiescence to injustice, but the trusting resolve of responsible agents under the eye of a watchful and just God on evangelistic mission. These instructions tell us that there is no life station or circumstance in which the saints of God cannot carry out their mission, provided they are also the holy people of God. at once markedly distinguished from their neighbors while also being neighbors to their neighbors, which is key. Or as the Epistle of Diognetus would put it later, these are persons distinguished not by country, nor language, nor customs, but by their confessedly striking manner of life. Their holiness is not in social separation, but in lifestyle distinction, with an unalloyed allegiance to God alone. This, I propose, is the renewal wrought first in the church and then by the church, whereby her members grace even the structures of oppressive regimes with the new creation life of the age to come, now already come in Jesus, crucified and resurrected. So, if having briefly, maybe not briefly enough, interrogated this text, can we now, just for a moment, let it interrogate us? First, while we should not underestimate the unique circumstances that bequeath to us this Petrine ecclesiology, neither should we fail to appropriate its abiding witness to the identity and mission of the people of God in all times and places. We should not suppose that this resourceful apology, born of social dislocation, speaks of a church other than the one which we inhabit. This is not them, it is also us. Empire, guild, slavery, xenophobia, and religious suspicion conspired to snuff out the holy life of the elect people of God, and despite much apparent success, to no ultimate avail. The holy and cruciform people of God are purified as though through fire, even as they simultaneously sanctify a culture bent on defiling them. It will be true that few of us, not to say few of our international brothers and sisters, but few of us will experience the cost of social ostracism and marginalization with the sort of grave intensity of these our forebears. If aliens and strangers is a metaphor for these first century Christians, and I have argued that it was, it is nonetheless a metaphor realistically attached to experiences of pain, suffering, and loss. For us, however, the metaphor is purer, but existentially weaker for that. For this reason, the dead metaphor of exile asks whether and how holiness, that divinely ordered differentiation from a pervasive godlessness, manifests itself practically in our own choices and allegiances. And modern Western Christians might further ask if we are only sophisticated enough to eschew the sectarians' misadventures in legalism, but not imaginative enough to embody much of the real thing for ourselves. Secondly, let us take note of the felicitous coexistence of ecclesial forms of life, which, by affiliation and habit of mind, we are apt to set over against each other. Begging your pardon in advance for an anachronism, I note that this Petrine ecclesiology is, first of all, Catholic, as we saw, and the Anglican. It presumes an ecclesial existence in covenantal continuity with Abraham. It projects a sacramentally mediated ontological union with Christ, living stones knit into the living stone. It evinces an awareness of a church more universal, your brotherhood throughout the world, he refers to it later. It eschews the voluntarism and individualism of privatized spirituality. There are the raw materials for the presbyteral and episcopal ministrations in order. Chapter 5. Even in form, it embeds pre-existing confessional traditions over and over. It is not too much to say that this is early Catholicism. But as social science engagements of 1 Peter have proposed, the proposed self-understanding of these communities is socially, not ecclesially, but socially sectarian. We don't usually hold these together. Catholics and Anabaptists. This is a Catholic Anabaptist vision, sort of. By socially sectarian, we do not mean the kind of isolating and differentiating intra-religious sectarianism that is the antithesis of Catholic, right? The one that says we're the only true Christians. That's not what we mean. But rather the self-understanding, frequently on the other side of power among marginalized and weak people, that intuits and accepts the inevitable social otherness of a bounded community. In that sense, this is a sectarian, socially sectarian vision. Now, if this is an accident of history, it still invites the best of our Catholic imagination to imagine a Christian form of life risky and resilient enough to threaten powers and to elicit this sort of suspicion in the world. Without idealizing these undoubtedly flawed historic communities, might we not find here also a judgment on our too easy and often unthinking acquiescence to corrupted and corrosive forms of life? Finally, as we have argued, the Petrine Church is irrepressibly evangelical. The providence of God has made his elect in Christ people involuntarily to infiltrate the Gentile world. And there is no one who cannot tell out the virtues of the redeeming God, and no one who lacks audience to do so. Even if this witness be quiet, sometimes wordless, as the wives were so instructed for their unbelieving husbands, all are called to be ready to give an account of their hope and to answer the charge that they are Christianos, Christians, the slur, Christian. Thus, this is not a sectarian ecclesiology, but a form of life concomitant with election and holiness over against an identifiably broken world passing into obsolescence that cannot but be resisted. This, however, is merely the descriptive presupposition of what is more ultimately an infiltrationist model. The infiltrationist model requires all the differentiation of the sectarian model and none of the isolation. It is the hardest path. Isolation is easy. Going along to get along is easy. Being the holy people of God and neighbor to neighbor is the hardest path. So these differentiated members are fully engaged, and dangerously so, and sometimes by the mercy and providence of God, efficaciously so. This is the vocation of the elect people of God as holy priesthood. We believe in one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. The author of 1 Peter does also, which is to say, one yet scattered, socially differentiated, bravely infiltrationist, subversively evangelical Catholic Church. May we be so. Thank you.